As long as the grass is green and the waters run. Green Grass Running Water is a novel written in 1993 by Cherokee and Greek/German-American author Thomas King. Although he was born and raised in the United States, King has lived in Canada since 1980, possessing dual citizenship. Green Grass Running Water is set in a contemporary First Nations Blackfoot community in Alberta. The novel gained attention due to its unique use of structure, narrative, and the fusion of oral and written literary traditions. The novel is rife with humor and satire, particularly regarding Judeo-Christian beliefs as well as Western government and society. The title of the novel, Green Grass Running Water, is a reference to the Canadian government promising the Indigenous people rights to their land as long as the grass is green and the waters run. The significance of land in Indigenous cultures and the politics of land claims is a central theme in the novel. The novel is composed of 4 major plot lines. The first follows 4 Indigenous elders, along with the trickster god Coyote, who escape from a psychiatric hospital with the goal of fixing the world. They are pursued by Dr. Hobow, the owner of the hospital, and his assistant, Babbo. The second plotline follows Lionel Red Dog, Charlie Looking Bear, and Alberta Frank, 3 modern-day Blackfeet attempting to navigate the perils of society and romance. The third plotline follows Lionel's uncle, Eli Stands Alone, whose presence is the only thing stopping the operation of a dam constructed on Indigenous land. The final plotline involves an unknown narrator recounting traditional Indigenous myths that have been infected with biblical figures and imagery, as well as characters from Western literature. Oh, postcolonialism. 'Tis such a simple word to encapsulate the apocalypse of countless cultures. Truly, how can a single theory hope to represent the emotions and history of myriad individuals? It seems to me almost diminishing to look at such diverse peoples and say, you are a post-colonial culture. By labeling them as such, you forever mark them with the brand of the colonizers. Though the conqueror may be long departed, indigenous traditions may never be reclaimed as long as you are portrayed in the context of the colonizers. But perhaps it is human nature to strive to classify that which we experience, to make sense of such overwhelming emotion. Perhaps analyzing events through a post-colonial lens is the only way to make sense of such overwhelming hatred and tragedy. But alas, I digress. I stray to topics more concerned with the psychoanalytical, maybe existential. However, perhaps one must consider all the possible lenses and how they are interwoven with each other to truly understand the story and characters behind the words. Let us focus once more solely on the post-colonial lens. How is it that the simple act of a Western man setting foot on Indigenous land can so thoroughly shred countless millennia of history, culture, tradition, and, most importantly, identity? What terrible weapon does the colonizer wield to so brutally expand his dominion? Rather than charging in with guns blazing, screaming declarations of war, I believe the truth to be something far more subtle and insidious. I posit that by committing theft of Indigenous culture, colonizers are able to destroy the identity of the aforementioned peoples, thus forcing them to become assimilated into Western culture. The foundation of an individual's identity, and thus the identity of a people, is, of course, their culture. And the foundation of a culture is religion. Religion is far more than just the worshipping of a deity. It is the story of a people's history, who they are, where they came from, their purpose in life. For a people to be left without religion is for them to be adrift in a hostile abyss, untethered from the wisdom of their ancestors. Thus, the first thing a colonizer must do to subjugate a people is to remove from them the sacred. Frantz Fanon, one of the foundational post-colonial theorists, also recognizes this colonial motivation. A national culture under colonial dominion is a contested culture whose destruction is sought in a systematic fashion. Techniques for doing so may differ throughout history, but their essence is identical. In the case of the indigenous peoples of North America, who are the subject of Green Grass Running Water, this took the form of residential schools, children kidnapped from their homes and histories, forced to recite the ideals of the Western faith. All it takes is one generation to be raised ignorant of their traditions for the chain, reaching back through the ages, to be forever sundered. One of the core plots of Green Grass Running Water is the retelling of Blackfoot creation myths. One must note, however, that these myths are not told in their pure form, as they would have been told in the past before the cruel touch of the West. Rather, they are tainted and infected by biblical figures. I know, says Coyote. Young man walking on water is talking about Christian rules. Yes, I says, that's true. Hooray, says Coyote, I love Christian rules. As you have undoubtedly guessed, young man walking on water is Jesus. He enters the myth being told and immediately begins to enforce his own ideals on the indigenous characters in the tale. I interpret this as Jesus being representative of the religious leaders responsible for the creation of residential schools. This just goes to show how trauma due to colonization so far in the past can still reach its thorn tendrils into the souls of future generations. Even worse, the removal of religious faith from a person leaves a gaping hole that yearns to be filled. It is human nature to feel a need to believe in something greater than our mortal selves. With Western colonizers having destroyed any remnant of indigenous belief, the only remaining faith in which to believe is that of the colonizers. It's a cruel twist of coincidence indeed that more often than not, the ideals of that Western faith lay out the inferiority of the indigenous peoples. Examples of this, too, are found within Green Grass Running Water. This one comes from an encounter with Noah, another biblical figure. "This is a Christian ship," he shouts. "I'm a Christian man. This is a Christian journey, and if you can't follow our Christian rules, then you're not wanted on the voyage." To be diminished by the very deities in which you must now believe delivers such a grievous wound upon the soul of the individual and the society that it is a simple matter for the Western colonizer to step in and impose an identity of servitude upon those oppressed people that were lost beyond the fading of the final memory. Land has always been at the center of the colonial conflict in North America. According to King, the issue has always been land. It will always be land until there isn't a square foot of land left in North America that is controlled by native people. For the indigenous peoples of North America, land is and always will be far more than just a place to live. The history of the people and the history of the land are interwoven in a tapestry of silk. For the millennia that they have dwelt here, indigenous peoples have always had an intimate understanding of the natural world that surrounded them. They were its stewards, its protectors, and in return the land bestowed upon them that which they needed to survive. The land holds as many stories of these people as their oral histories. It is an integral part of their identity. To displace them from this ground is to split a mother from her children, a brother from a sister. But tragically, that is what the West has done in North America. Part of the motivation must be ignorance, for how could a society accustomed to exploitation of nature understand this harmonious relationship? Another large part is, as it always has been, greed. Why colonize if you're not going to claim ownership over the vast landscape that you see before you? This conflict over land is another core plot of Green Grass Running Water. Eli stands alone, living alone in his deceased mother's cabin, no pun intended, is the only thing stopping the operation of a dam built on indigenous land. Eli had fought Duplessis from the beginning, producing a steady stream of injunctions that Duplessis countered. To Eli, the land that the cabin is built on represents not just the history of the Blackfoot, but the history of his own family, all the way back since his mother built the cabin by hand. Of course, greed and trickery go hand in hand, and the Western colonizers possess both in vast quantities. What they can't take by force, they steal through deception. Barrel load of crap about native rights, treaty rights, Cliff, almost as bad as French rights. Damn sure wish the government would give me some of that. Government didn't give us anything, Cliff. We paid for them 2 or 3 times. And so because the government felt generous back in the last ice age and made promises it never intended to keep. And the worst part is that the colonizers that signed those treaties don't even see it as dishonorable to break them. Their word does not bind them when it is given to a culture that they consider to be so far beneath them. To the arrogant and self-superior colonizers, it's the same as if you gave your promise to an insect. You consider it so far beneath your notice that the promise would be forgotten as soon as you turned your attention elsewhere. Perhaps much dispute could be resolved if only the West was able to perceive that land can hold something more valuable than potential coin and profit. How can you force a culture to reject its own traditions, patterns that have been observed for far longer than most of its people can remember? How can you take that which is sacred to the heart and transmute it into something fit to be discarded? Those are questions that Western colonizers are well prepared to answer. As long as the conquered, for to colonize is truly to conquer, people are able to hold to old habits, the colonizers will never have truly won. So what the oppressor must do is take the special and make it the routine and contemptible. Indigenous ceremony becomes entertainment for the masses. In this way, the West is able to steal the traditions from the indigenous peoples from whence it came and make it their own. France Fanon too remarks on this behavior. The negation of the native's culture, the contempt for any manifestation of culture, whether active or emotional, contribute to breed aggressive patterns of behavior in the native. Through the act of stealing these traditions and feeding them to the gluttonous masses, who then regurgitate a rotted mimicry, Western colonizers are able to despoil a fundamental component of indigenous identity. Evidence of this can be found within the pages of Greengrass Running Water. At the Blackfoot community's annual Sundance, a ceremony practiced by some indigenous peoples in North America, usually involves the community gathering together to pray for healing, as well as individuals making personal sacrifices on behalf of the community. George, ex-husband of Letitia, appears and attempts to take photographs of the event. "You can't believe in this shit," George shouts after Eli. "This is Ice Age crap." Lionel moved forward, and George fell back several steps. "Probably time to go," said Lionel. "Come on," said George. "Come on, it's the 20th century. Nobody cares about your little powwow. A bunch of old people and drunks sitting around in tents in the middle of nowhere. Nobody cares about any of this. I mean, it's not exactly sacred, is it? More like a campout or picnic." In this case, the Blackfeet were able to defend their traditions from perverted voyeurs. However, they were not so lucky later on. "Shouldn't put the outfits down like that," said Amos. "It isn't right." "Guess we're the ones to say what's right and what's not right," said the guard. "Isn't that right?" "That's sacred stuff," said Amos. On their way to the Sundance, Amos's family had their outfits seized by border security for no reason other than the typical Western fear, disgust, and hatred of the unfamiliar. Unfortunately, indigenous peoples lack both the numbers and the power to resist their Western oppressors. The only way indigenous peoples are able to resist this colonial theft is to follow the advice of Frantz Fanon and wield the power of art and literature. Gives precision to the literary utterances of the native intellectual. The continued cohesion of the peoples constitutes for the intellectual an invitation to go further than his cry of protest. The whole people to fight for the existence of a nation. It is a literature of combat. Before concluding, I would like to note that the dutiful post-colonial critic must consider scope wider than solely that which is found within the media being analyzed. As stated previously, Greengrass Running Water was written by Thomas King, an author claiming Cherokee descent. Unfortunately, Greengrass Running Water was published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt Company hardcover and Bantam Books for the paperback. Both companies are owned and operated by individuals of Western descent. Due to this, one must immediately question whether the viewpoints and arguments expressed in the novel are truly King's own, or have they been censored by his publishers to better fit the Western agenda. Furthermore, the North American publishing industry is a monopoly of 5 companies, often referred to as the Big Five, all of which are controlled by those of Western descent. This calls into question whether the unaltered voice of indigenous peoples in North America can ever be freely expressed. At this point, I wouldn't blame you for thinking, what's the point of all this? Colonization has happened. No level of understanding can change the past. However, we are in a rare situation where, for the first time in history, the West is actually trying to fix their mistakes and make up for the fear and pain that they have inflicted on indigenous peoples. One must understand the weapon in order to heal the wound. We need to understand how that pain was inflicted before we can start to repair the damaged relationship between indigenous peoples and the West. This is of particular relevance to us as Canadians. Few other governments, I say government in quotes due to the fact that indigenous peoples didn't really have the opportunity to choose who their oppressors were, have mistreated their indigenous peoples to the extent that we have. It's no coincidence that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada put truth before reconciliation. Although you and me as individuals may not be directly responsible for the actions of past colonizers, we all have a responsibility as fellow humans to propagate the truth. "Oops," says Coyote, "we have a problem. Only if you're an Indian," I says. "You're right," says Coyote. "I'm probably a coyote."